The morning had broken soft and pale, with the kind of light that painted everything silver. Clara Sutton followed the creek's winding path as she often did, her worn boots pressing into the damp earth. The air smelled of rain and sagebrush, and the only sound was the gentle murmur of water slipping over stones. She came here for peace, for the stillness that dulled the ache of loneliness. But that morning peace wasn't waiting for her. A movement caught her eye, a shadow among the reeds. She froze. At first, she thought it was an animal, maybe a coyote. But then she saw him. A man knelt by the edge of the creek, his back broad and scarred beneath a torn shirt. His long, dark hair was tied loosely with a strip of leather, and his skin glowed bronze in the morning light. He was Apache. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Every instinct told her to turn back, to run before he saw her. The stories the townsfolk told about Apache warriors, the raids, the blood, the danger, echoed in her mind. Yet she didn't move. Something about him didn't fit those tales. His shoulders trembled and his hands, large capable hands, fumbled clumsily with a small needle and a strip of sinew thread. He was trying to mend the tear in his shirt. The effort looked painful. He pricked his finger, hissed softly, then tried again, but his hands were shaking too badly. That was when Clara realized he was hurt. The side of his shirt was stained with dried blood. He wasn't a threat. He was a man trying to hold himself together. Before she knew it, she was stepping closer. Her heart hammered in her chest, every step a battle between fear and compassion. The ground was soft, her skirt brushing against the tall grass. When she was close enough to see the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, she spoke, her voice trembling. "You'll make it worse that way." The man froze, his head lifting sharply. His gaze found hers, dark, wary, sharp as a hawk's. For a long moment, neither moved. She could feel his tension like a coiled spring, his hand hovering near the knife at his belt. Clara raised her hands slowly, palms open. "I mean no harm," she said softly. "Let me help." He didn't answer. His breathing was steady but heavy, and his eyes searched her face as though weighing her soul. Then, with a slow nod, he set the needle down beside him. She knelt in the grass across from him. Her fingers trembled at first as she picked up the needle, the same one he'd been struggling with. It was small, bent from use. She could feel the heat of his gaze as she threaded it, her own breath uneven. "You're hurt," she said quietly. He gave a slight nod but didn't speak. His lips pressed into a thin line, pride and pain tangled together. She began stitching the torn fabric carefully, the sinew pulling tight under her fingers. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was charged, alive. Every movement felt intimate, forbidden somehow, as if mending his shirt was more than an act of kindness. It was a bridge between two worlds that weren't supposed to meet. After a while, she could feel his gaze soften. He watched her hands, small, quick, certain, and she saw something shift in his eyes. Trust, maybe, or wonder that someone like her would help a man like him. When she finished, she tied off the stitch neatly and sat back. "There," she murmured, brushing the dust from her skirt. He looked down at the repaired seam, then at her. "Why?" he asked finally, his voice low, rough, uncertain in English. She blinked at the question, then smiled faintly. "Because someone should." For a moment, the only sound was the creek babbling beside them. Then she reached into her satchel and pulled out a small loaf of bread, offering it to him. He hesitated, eyes flicking from her hand to her face, then took it slowly, his fingers brushing hers. It was a small touch, but it lingered like fire. Clara rose to her feet, her heart still pounding. "Take care of yourself," she said softly. He didn't reply, only watched her as she walked away through the mist, a silent warrior with a mended shirt, holding the bread of a stranger who hadn't been afraid. And though she didn't know it yet, that single act of kindness had changed both their lives forever. The next morning, the sun rose over the plains like a slow-burning ember. Clara tried to lose herself in chores, gathering eggs, splitting, kindling, feeding the mule, but her hands were clumsy, her thoughts restless. She couldn't shake the image of him, the Apache by the creek, his dark eyes watching her with quiet intensity. She told herself he was long gone. Men like him didn't linger near white settlements. It was too dangerous. Yet when she returned to the creek that afternoon to fill her pails, her heart stuttered. He was there. He stood across the water, mended shirt clinging cleanly to his shoulders now, his hair damp as if he'd been washing. For a moment, neither moved. The silence between them stretched thin as a thread. Clara swallowed hard. "You shouldn't be here," she said quietly, though her voice lacked conviction. He tilted his head slightly, studying her. "You came back," he replied in accented English, each word careful, deliberate. The simplicity of it caught her off guard. "I fetch water here every day," she said, defensive though she didn't know why. "It's my land." He looked down at the creek, a faint smile ghosting over his lips. "Water belongs to no one." That silenced her. She felt foolish, not because he was right, but because of how gently he'd said it. There was no mockery in his tone, only truth. She lowered her pails and knelt by the edge, dipping them in the current. When she looked up again, he was closer. Not threateningly so, just near enough for her to see the shadows under his eyes. "Did you sleep?" she asked, before she could stop herself. He blinked, surprised by the question, then nodded slightly. "By the trees." His gaze softened. "You sew well." The words, plain and honest, sent a strange warmth through her chest. "Years of practice," she said, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. "My husband," she paused, voice catching. "He tore his clothes faster than I could fix them." There was silence again, but a different kind this time. Not the wary silence of strangers. This one felt full, almost comforting. "I thank you," he said at last, his tone hushed. "You could have left me there." Clara looked at him steadily. "You didn't look like someone who meant harm." He gave a low, humorless laugh. "My face says otherwise to your people." She hesitated, then answered softly. "My people see what they're told to see." He looked up sharply, eyes catching hers. For the first time, she saw something almost like surprise in them, maybe even respect. The air between them changed. The tension still there, but tempered by something new, understanding. A hawk cried overhead, circling lazily in the vast sky. Clara stood, gripping the heavy pails. "You shouldn't stay too close to the town," she warned. "The soldiers have been through these parts again. They don't ask questions before shooting." He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "You speak truth." She hesitated, then reached into her apron pocket. "Here," she said, offering him a small cloth bundle. "Dried meat. It'll keep better than bread." He didn't move at first. Then, as if realizing this gesture was as dangerous for her as it was kind, he reached out and took it. His fingers brushed hers again. A small spark, fleeting yet alive. "I am called Tahoma," he said suddenly, as though giving her his name cost him something precious. "Clara," she answered. Her name sounded different in the quiet between them, softer somehow. He nodded once, almost a bow, then turned toward the hills. She watched him go until he was only a figure moving through the tall grass, blending with the earth and sky. As she lifted her pails, she realized her heart was pounding again. Not from fear this time, but from something far more dangerous. Curiosity. That night, long after the lamps were out and the crickets sang outside her cabin, she found herself staring at the small needle still lying by her bedside, the same one she'd used to mend his shirt. She ran her thumb over the cool metal, remembering the way his hands had trembled when he'd tried to sew. Somehow, in that silent exchange by the creek, two broken lives had begun to stitch together, slow, uncertain, but sure. 2 days passed before Clara saw him again. The spring air had turned warm. The sky stretched wide and blue over the plains. She was in her small garden behind the cabin, pruning early shoots, when the horses began to stir. Her mule brayed, restless, a warning she'd come to trust. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and looked up. There he was. Tahoma stood near the edge of the trees, half in sunlight, half in shadow. His expression was unreadable, but his stance spoke of weariness. The shirt she'd mended still clung to him, though she could see new dirt, new wear, and dried blood around the edges. He hadn't left. Or maybe he'd tried, but something had brought him back. Clara hesitated, torn between common sense and compassion. The town would never forgive her if they knew she was harboring an Apache. But his eyes, those dark, steady eyes, held a quiet plea she couldn't ignore. "Come inside," she said finally, her voice gentler than she meant it to be. He followed her to the cabin, cautious but not afraid. She motioned to the chair near the hearth. "Sit," she said. "You look half dead." He obeyed, lowering himself stiffly. When she fetched a bowl of water and a clean cloth, he didn't protest. As she knelt to clean his arm, she noticed the fresh wound, a long, angry gash running from shoulder to elbow. "Who did this?" she asked softly. "Men," he said after a pause. "White soldiers, near the ridge." Her breath caught. "They're patrolling out that far?" He nodded. "They saw me. I ran." She pressed the cloth gently against his wound, but her hands trembled. The thought of what might have happened, of how easily he could have been shot and left for the crows, filled her with a strange mix of anger and fear. He noticed. "You are afraid," he said. "For you," she admitted before she could stop herself. That made him look at her, really look. His gaze softened, but behind it she saw surprise, almost disbelief. Slowly he lifted his hand and touched her wrist, a gesture meant to steady her. His touch was warm, rough from labor and battle. "Do not fear for me," he said. "I have lived through worse." But when she peeled the fabric of his shirt away, her heart twisted. His body was a map of pain, old scars crossing new ones, some thin and silver, others raw and jagged. Each mark told a story she couldn't bear to imagine. "How can one man survive all this?" she whispered. "Because I must," he said simply. "Because to die is to let them win." She swallowed hard, blinking back the sting in her eyes. Her fingers brushed against his shoulder as she cleaned another wound. His muscles tensed not from pain but from restraint, the same kind she felt tightening in her chest. "You don't have to hide these," she said quietly, nodding toward the scars. "They don't make you less, they make you human." He turned to her, his gaze steady and unreadable. "To your people they make me a savage." Clara paused, the words like a stone in her throat. Then, softly, she said, "Not to me." The silence that followed felt like something breaking, not a sound, but a wall. She didn't know who moved first, only that the air shifted between them. For a heartbeat, they were no longer widow and warrior, white and Apache, just two souls who'd both seen too much loss. She forced herself to stand, to break the spell. "You should rest," she murmured, setting aside the cloth. "I'll make soup." He said nothing, only watched her move about the cabin, his expression unreadable but intent. When she brought him the steaming bowl, he accepted it wordlessly, their fingers brushing once more. As he ate, she caught the faintest flicker of gratitude in his eyes, not just for the food, but for something deeper. Understanding. Safety. When he finished, he looked at her again and said softly, "Clara." Her heart skipped. It was the first time he'd spoken her name. "Yes?" He hesitated, then looked down at his mended shirt. "Your hands," he said, voice low, almost reverent. "They make things whole." She didn't answer. Couldn't. The words sank deep into her chest, warm and frightening all at once. Outside, the wind whispered through the cottonwoods, carrying with it a promise neither of them dared to speak yet, that the lines drawn by blood and fear could sometimes be crossed by something far gentler. The first drops of rain fell just as dusk began to settle. The sky had turned a bruised shade of gray, thick clouds rolling over the plains like herds of dark buffalo. Clara was returning from checking her snares when thunder cracked so loud it seemed to shake the earth beneath her boots. She pulled, her shawl tighter, and started toward the cabin, and that's when she saw him again. Tahoma stood at the tree line, his hair slick with rain, eyes glinting in the flash of lightning. He looked worn, more from exhaustion than injury. Their eyes met, and neither needed to speak. The storm was coming fast, and there was only one place nearby with a roof. "Come on," Clara called over the wind. "You'll drown out here." He hesitated, maybe from pride, maybe fear of what it meant to step into a white woman's home. But the next peal of thunder left him no choice. He followed her through the rain, his long strides catching up easily as the wind whipped around them. By the time they reached her cabin, the downpour had turned heavy, drumming on the roof like stones. She pushed the door open, and they both stumbled inside, soaked to the bone. "Sit by the fire," she said, shutting the door against the storm. "You'll freeze if you stay wet." He did as told, crouching near the hearth while she stoked the flames higher. Water dripped from his hair onto the floorboards. His shirt clung to his chest, the fabric dark with rain, and blood, she realized. The wound on his arm had reopened. Clara's hands moved before her mind could catch up. She grabbed a towel, a dry blanket, and her small basket of salves. "You're bleeding again." He looked up at her, the firelight flickering in his dark eyes. "It's nothing." "Nothing," she echoed, kneeling beside him. "You'll lose the arm if you don't let it heal." When she touched his sleeve, he flinched slightly, not in pain but in something deeper, an instinctive defense. For a moment she feared he'd pull away. Instead, he exhaled and let his shoulders drop. She took that as permission. Her fingers worked carefully, unwrapping the makeshift bandage he'd tied with a strip of cloth. The wound was angry and raw. She dabbed it with clean water, then applied a paste of comfrey and pine resin. The silence between them was broken only by the storm's fury outside. Thunder growling, rain hammering the roof. "You've done this before," he murmured. Clara smiled faintly. "On my husband, when he came home from his hunting trips. Men never let things heal properly." He tilted his head slightly. "And your husband? He is gone?" The question was soft, but it still pierced. "3 winters now," she said quietly. Fever took him before the thaw. He nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "You stay alone?" She gave a small laugh, more weary than amused. "Most days I prefer it. People talk too much, and I've had my fill of being pitied." He seemed to understand that in a way few could. "Silence can be kind," he said. They fell quiet again, the air thick with warmth from the fire and something heavier. Awareness. She could feel the heat of him beside her, the scent of rain and earth clinging to his skin. His hand rested on his knee, close enough that the edge of her sleeve brushed against his knuckles. Lightning flashed through the window, lighting his face. Sharp lines softened by fatigue and trust. For an instant, Clara forgot about the storm entirely. "Rest," she whispered, pulling the blanket around his shoulders. "You'll be safe here tonight." He looked at her, his eyes meeting hers with quiet intensity. "Safe," he repeated, as if testing the word's truth. Then, after a long pause, "I will stay until the rain stops." She nodded. "That's all right." Hours passed. The storm raged on, relentless. They shared a simple supper of broth and bread. He said little, but his presence filled the small room, steady, grounding. When the wind howled outside, she glanced toward him, and he met her gaze each time, as if to remind her she wasn't alone. When the fire finally burned low, Tahoma lay by the hearth, his breathing deep and even. Clara sat nearby, watching the rain trace down the window pane. She should have been afraid of what people would say, of what she was feeling. But instead, she felt something else. Peace. For the first time since her husband's death, the cabin didn't feel empty, and as thunder rolled one last time across the plains, she realized that the storm had not just driven him into her shelter, It had broken open the walls around her heart. The storm passed with the sunrise. When Clara opened her eyes the next morning, golden light streamed through the cabin's small window, warming the rough wood floor. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the room was filled with that stillness that follows heavy rain. Soft, new, almost sacred. She sat up slowly, realizing she wasn't alone. Tahoma was sitting by the window, his back to her. He was bare-chested, washing his shirt in a basin of water, his movements quiet and deliberate. Steam rose from the wet cloth, and his long hair, still damp, hung down his spine like a dark ribbon. For a long moment, she simply watched. There was something peaceful about him now. The tension in his shoulders eased, his expression calm. The light painted the lines of his muscles and the scars she'd seen the night before. Each mark caught the sunlight differently, a record of everything he had survived. He must have felt her eyes on him because he turned slightly, his gaze meeting hers. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Then he said in that deep, careful tone she was beginning to know, "The storm is gone." Clara smiled faintly. "Seems so. You sleep well?" He nodded once. The first time in many nights. She rose, brushing her hair back. "Then I'm glad the rain came." The words hung between them, heavier than they sounded. She busied herself at the stove, heating water for coffee, trying not to think about how his presence filled every corner of her small cabin. She told herself he'd leave soon. He had to. Men like him didn't belong in the quiet rhythm of a widow's life. But when she turned back, he was still there, and he was mending his shirt again. The rip she'd sewn days ago had torn once more near the shoulder. His fingers held the needle clumsily, as they had that first day by the creek. She watched him struggle, his brow furrowed in concentration, the needle trembling between his thick fingers. "Here," she said softly. "You'll ruin the thread that way." He looked up, almost embarrassed. "I try to learn," he said. "But the hands," he lifted them slightly, "they do not listen." Clara crossed the room and knelt beside him. "Then let them listen to mine." She took the needle from him, gently this time, almost ceremoniously. His hand lingered, the tips of his fingers brushing hers. She felt a small shiver run up her arm, but didn't pull away. Instead, she began to sew. He watched her quietly, his breath steady. "You move like the river," he said after a moment, his voice so low she almost missed it. Clara's hand stilled. "What?" He smiled slightly. "Slow but sure. You never fight the flow?" She laughed softly, surprised by the poetry in his words. "You talk prettier than most men in town." His smile widened just a little, but his eyes held something deeper. Admiration, perhaps even affection. "Your people talk much," he said, "but they do not listen." "You listen." Her laughter faded. "Maybe because there's not much else to do out here." "No," he said simply. "Because you have heart." Her breath caught. No one had spoken to her like that in years. Not since before her husband died. Not with truth that simple, that disarming. She bent her head again, pretending to focus on her sewing, but her hands trembled slightly now. When the final stitch was done, she tied it neatly and handed him the shirt. "There, try again tomorrow," she teased softly. He took it, his fingers brushing hers again, deliberate this time. "I will learn," he said. "You teach well." There was something in his tone that made her heart flutter, something that wasn't about sewing at all. Later, when she went outside to hang the washing, she caught sight of him chopping wood near the fence. He worked with quiet strength, every swing sure and graceful. When he looked up, their eyes met again, and this time, neither looked away. They didn't need words. The way his hand brushed hers when he passed the bucket, the way she left an extra plate for him at supper, the way their eyes lingered longer each time. It all spoke a language neither had been taught but both somehow understood. That night, as she lay awake, Clara realized something had changed. Not in the world, but in the space between them. It was as though the air itself had learned to hold its breath when they were near. She told herself it was only gratitude, only friendship. But when she remembered his voice and low, steady, calling her river, she knew that wasn't true. Whatever this was, it was growing. Quietly, steadily, like the green shoots pushing through the soil after a long, hard rain. By midsummer, the plains had turned gold and the air shimmered with heat. The storm that had bound them together had long passed, but its echo lingered in the quiet rhythms of their days. Tahoma stayed longer than either of them had planned. He repaired her roof, mended the fence, and hunted when the snares came up empty. His presence became part of the land itself, silent, steady, unspoken. And in that stillness, Clara began to forget what the world outside might think, until the whispers started. It began with Mrs. Green, who ran the trading post in town. Clara had ridden in for flour and lamp oil, her hat low against the sun. As she counted out coins on the counter, Mrs. Green's eyes narrowed. "Been seeing smoke out by your cabin?" she said casually. "Thought you lived alone." Clara's hand froze over the coins. "I do," she lied. Mrs. Green leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Strange then, folks saying they've seen a man near your land." "Big fella, dark-skinned." Clara forced a smile. "Maybe a drifter. Plenty of them around after the war." Mrs. Green's mouth tightened. "Drifter or savage, it don't sit right. You be careful out there, Clara. Good women don't need trouble finding them." The word stung more than she wanted to admit. Clara finished her purchase quickly, feeling the heat of a dozen eyes on her back as she left town. By the time she reached her horse, her cheeks burned with anger and shame, not because of what they thought, but because of how easily they could destroy her for it. When she returned home, Tahoma was by the creek sharpening his knife. He looked up as she approached, sensing her tension before she spoke. "People have been talking," she said, tying off her horse, "about me." It wasn't a question. She sighed. "They don't understand." He looked back toward the horizon, his jaw tightening. "They never will." The way he said it, quiet, certain, cut deeper than any accusation. "They're scared," she said softly. "Scared of what they don't know." "Scared of—" She stopped herself. He turned toward her. "Of you and me." Her pulse quickened. "You make it sound like truth," he said simply. Clara drew in a breath, steadying herself. "You can't stay much longer. If the sheriff hears," his dark eyes held hers. "And if I leave?" She opened her mouth but couldn't find an answer. The thought of him gone, the silence, the empty table, the unbroken mornings, filled her with an ache she couldn't name. Instead, she said, "It's safer." He stood, slipping the knife into his belt. "For you, maybe." The air between them grew heavy. The sound of the creek, the wind through the cottonwoods, everything seemed to fade into that space of quiet hurt. "Tahoma," she began, but he shook his head. "I will not bring trouble to your door, Clara." His tone was final, but his eyes weren't. They softened, as if saying all the things words could not. "You have given me more kindness than I deserved. I will not see you pay for it." She stepped closer. "You think kindness has a price?" "In this world," he said, voice low, "everything does." Her throat tightened. She wanted to tell him he was wrong, that what grew between them wasn't something shameful or dangerous. But she saw the truth in his face. The world would never let a white widow and an Apache warrior exist in peace. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. Every creak of the wind made her imagine hooves. Every whisper of the leaves sounded like voices. Somewhere in the darkness, she thought she heard movement near the creek. Soft, careful, fading into the night. By dawn, Tahoma was gone, the fire was cold, the cabin empty, and the only trace he'd left was a single feather tied to her doorframe, black and white, bound with a strip of deer hide. A sign, she knew, of protection. A promise, maybe, that he'd watch from afar. Clara pressed it to her heart, eyes stinging. The whispers of the town had driven him away, but the echo of his presence clung to her like breath, warm, invisible, and impossible to forget. And though the world called it wrong, she knew what she felt was the truest thing she'd ever known. The days after Tahoma's disappearance were hollow, as if the life had been drained from the land itself. Clara went about her chores like a ghost, feeding the hens, mending clothes, chopping wood, but her hands moved without her heart. The cabin that had once felt full now echoed with silence. She told herself he'd done the right thing. That leaving had spared them both. But every night when the wind brushed through the pines, she imagined it was him whispering her name. Then one morning, as the sun rose pale and sharp over the ridge, she saw a cloud of dust in the distance. A single rider galloping hard toward her cabin. Her stomach tightened. It was Sheriff Hale. He dismounted before she could even greet him, boots crunching in the dirt. His face was set, his eyes narrow. "Morning, Clara." he said, voice thick with suspicion. Mind if I come in? She hesitated. If you've come for coffee, it's on the stove. He didn't smile. I've come for answers. Clara's pulse thudded. About what? About the Apache some folks say you've been harboring. Her breath hitched, but she kept her voice calm. There's been no one here but me. The sheriff glanced past her shoulder into the cabin. His gaze lingered on the extra cup hanging by the shelf, the freshly mended shirt folded near the fire. You sure about that? He asked quietly. She swallowed. You calling me a liar, Sheriff? He studied her face a long moment. I'm saying folks are nervous. A rancher claims one of his steers was taken down by a man with a bow. A few boys saw smoke near your woods. They think he's still around. Clara crossed her arms. And you think I'd lie to protect him? Hale's mouth tightened. I think you're a good woman. But good women make bad choices when they get lonely. The words hit like a slap. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. You tell me where he is, Clara. I'll see he's taken in alive. Otherwise, if one of the boys catches him first. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. She stared at him, her heart pounding. Then she said evenly, I've got nothing to tell you. The sheriff looked at her for a long, uneasy moment, then nodded. If you see him, you best pray you tell me first. Because if he's still out there, the men'll be hunting by nightfall. He tipped his hat and rode off, leaving a trail of dust and dread behind him. That evening, Clara stood by the creek clutching the feather he'd left behind. The sky bled crimson into the horizon and a terrible thought gripped her. What if they already found him? She couldn't stand still. She grabbed her lantern and rifle and followed the narrow path into the woods where they'd once gathered firewood together. Every step cracked twigs beneath her boots. Every shadow felt alive. The air was thick with the scent of pine and coming rain. Then she heard it, a rustle behind the rocks near the ridge. She raised the lantern. Tahoma, she whispered. He stepped out slowly, eyes wary but soft when they met hers. His hair was damp from the mist, his clothes torn from travel. You shouldn't have come, he said. They're hunting you, she breathed. The sheriff, he knows. He nodded grimly. I've seen their firelight. I was leaving before they reached the valley. She shook her head. No, you can't keep running. He smiled faintly. That's all my people ever did. Tears burned her eyes. Then let me help you. I'll hide you. Just until they... Clara, he interrupted softly, stepping closer. If they find you helping me, they'll burn your home. You'll lose everything. I already lost everything when you left, she whispered. For a heartbeat, silence hung between them, broken only by the chirr of crickets and the rush of the creek. Then, slowly, he reached out and cupped her face, his thumb tracing her cheek like a promise. You're not meant for this kind of fight, he said. But she met his gaze fiercely. Then let me fight anyway. In that moment, with the glow of the lantern between them, they both knew the line had been crossed forever. Whatever came next, sheriff, townsman, or fire, they would face it together. And somewhere in the trees, the cry of a distant hawk echoed, as if the land itself bore witness to the choice that bound their fates. By the time the first torchlight appeared through the trees, Clara already knew the town had chosen violence. The night was thick and humid, the kind of stillness that comes before a storm. She and Tahoma stood at the edge of the cabin clearing, listening to the distant shouts, men calling to one another, their voices laced with the crude excitement of a hunt. They're close, Tahoma murmured, scanning the ridge. Too close. Clara gripped her rifle tighter. We can still reach the creek. There's a path. He shook his head. They'll have men there too. He moved to the cabin door, his movements calm but purposeful, as if he had accepted something she couldn't yet name. The firelight from their lantern flickered across his face, painting shadows beneath his eyes. They'll burn this place, he said quietly. They won't leave it standing once they find me. Clara's throat constricted. Then we'll stop them before they do. Tahoma turned, meeting her gaze. You can't fight them all. I can fight for what's mine. The words left her mouth before she could stop them. For a moment, he simply looked at her, really looked at her, like she was the last thing in the world that made sense. Then, without a word, he handed her a knife from his belt. Then we fight, he said softly. The glow of torches grew brighter. Soon the first figures broke through the trees, 5 men, then 10. The sheriff led them, his hat low, rifle drawn. Clara, he shouted. Step aside. We've got no quarrel with you, only the savage. She stood on her porch, the rifle steady in her hands despite the tremor running through her heart. You've got no right to come onto my land, Hale, he sneered. That right comes when you start harboring killers. Killers? She snapped. You think he's the one murdering your cattle? He's been fixing fences, not breaking them. The men muttered among themselves, uneasy. The sheriff raised his voice. You expect us to believe you? Look at him. Tahoma stepped into view, tall and silent, his shadow spilling across the porch beside hers. His calmness unsettled them, it always did. Last chance, Hale warned. Move aside, Clara. She didn't. A tense silence fell. Then someone at the back tossed a torch. It hit the side of the cabin, flames licking up the dry wood in an instant. Clara gasped and swung her rifle, firing into the air. The crack split the night like thunder. Enough, she shouted. You'll burn this whole valley before you see sense. But the men were already backing away, startled by her defiance. Hale cursed under his breath and raised his gun. But before he could fire, Tahoma stepped forward. Leave her, he said, voice low and even. This fight is with me. Damn right it is, Hale spat, pulling the trigger. The shot went wide as Tahoma lunged aside. Clara fired back, the bullet shattering the sheriff's hat clean off. The men scattered, shouting. Torches fell. Flames spread. Smoke filled the air, choking and black. Tahoma grabbed Clara's wrist. We have to go. I won't leave my home. She coughed. He turned her toward him, eyes fierce. You can build another home. I can't build another you. For a moment everything froze, the fire, the shouting, the panic. His hand on her cheek, the taste of ash in the air. Then she nodded. They ran for the creek, the heat of the burning cabin at their backs. Behind them, the men shouted in confusion, too blinded by smoke to follow. When they reached the water, Clara stumbled to her knees, tears cutting tracks through the soot on her face. The cabin was gone, everything she had built burned to the ground. Tahoma knelt beside her, his hand steady on her shoulder. They'll come again, he said quietly. She looked up at him through the haze. Then we'll be ready next time. For the first time that night, a faint smile ghosted across his lips. You sound like a warrior, she met his gaze. Maybe I learned from one. And as the flames roared in the distance, two shadows, one white, one Apache, moved deeper into the darkness, bound now by something fiercer than fear, the fire of survival, and the promise that love could rise even from ashes. The fire devoured everything Clara had built. By dawn, her cabin was nothing more than a skeleton of ash and smoke, curling into a pale morning sky. The land smelled of loss. The sheriff and his men were gone, chased off by the flames or by the guilt that came after. But Clara knew they'd return. Men like them always did. Tahoma saddled the horse in silence. His face was streaked with soot, his eyes hard but sorrowful. Clara stood beside him, clutching a small leather satchel, the only thing she'd saved. Inside were a few keepsakes, her mother's brooch, a Bible, and the feather he had left her. She looked back once at the blackened ruin. That was my home. Tahoma turned to her. Home is where you're free. She met his gaze, steady and tired. Then let's find it. They rode at sunrise, heading north through the canyon trail. The land opened around them, wild and endless, the way only the frontier could be. Red earth, silent ridges, a hawk gliding overhead. The air was sharp, the kind that cleanses and cuts at once. For hours they rode without speaking. Only when the sun climbed high did Clara finally break the silence. They'll come after us. Yes, Tahoma said simply. You don't seem worried. He glanced at her, a ghost of a smile touching his mouth. Worry does not change the trail, she huffed softly. You sound like a preacher. I sound like a man who's been chased before. Something in the way he said it made her chest ache. You've lost others, haven't you? He was quiet a long while before answering. Everyone I've loved has been taken by men who thought they owned the land, the sky and the people beneath both. Clara's throat tightened. And now you've lost everything again because of me. He turned in the saddle, his eyes meeting hers with that calm, piercing strength. No, because of love. And love is not loss. The words sank into her like sunlight through cold water. For the first time since the fire, she breathed without the weight of fear pressing down. They made camp that night near a stream beneath the pines. Tahoma built the fire while Clara gathered water, her hands trembling from exhaustion. As she set the pot over the flames, she looked up and found him watching her. What? She asked softly. He shook his head. You never stop moving. If I stop, she said, I'll think too much. He smiled faintly. Then rest. I'll think for both of us. She sank down beside him, the warmth of the fire dancing across their faces. The night was quiet except for the hum of crickets and the rustle of leaves. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Clara whispered, "What will we do when they find us?" Tahoma poked at the fire with a stick, his expression thoughtful. "We keep riding. There are valleys farther west, places where the white man's law doesn't reach yet. My mother's kin may still live near the Red Mesa. If they do, they will take us in." She nodded slowly. "And if they don't?" He looked at her then, his gaze soft but unyielding. "Then we build our own place. One no one can burn." A lump rose in her throat. She wanted to believe him, to believe the world would allow such a thing. But looking into his eyes, she realized it didn't matter what the world allowed. What mattered was that he believed it and she believed in him. As the fire dimmed to embers, he reached out, his rough fingers brushing her hand. The touch was hesitant, reverent, like a vow whispered in a sacred place. "I thought my life ended with the wars," he said quietly. "But then you found me mending my shirt. You saw me when no one else dared to look." Clara swallowed hard. "You were trembling that day." "I still am," he admitted, "but not from fear anymore." She turned her hand over, threading her fingers through his. "Then tremble with me." They sat there, two souls bound by ash and hope, watching the stars climb higher until the first light of dawn spilled over the ridge. Tomorrow would bring danger. The sheriff might return. The world might never forgive them. But tonight, under the open sky, they were free. No whispers, no shame, no walls of wood or fear. Just the sound of the wind through the trees and the steady rhythm of two hearts finally beating in the same world. The trail led them higher into the mountains, beyond where wagons dared go, beyond the reach of the law and the hate that hunted them. The land changed with every mile, from sun-baked desert to whispering pines, from dry dust to cool mist. It was as if the earth itself was hiding them, folding them into its arms. By the fourth day, Clara's body ached, but her spirit burned steady. She had left behind everything she knew, her name in town, her home, her safety, but she'd never felt so alive. Every sunrise was a blessing, every heartbeat proof that they had outrun the flames. Tahoma rode ahead, his silhouette sharp against the bright morning sky. When he stopped at the crest of a ridge, Clara guided her horse up beside him and gasped. Below them stretched a hidden valley, green and untouched, wrapped by cliffs on every side. A river ran like a ribbon of light through its heart. Birds moved over the water in silver flashes, and wildflowers swayed in the wind. "It's," she whispered, unable to find the words. "Home," he finished softly. For the first time since they'd met, his voice held something new. Hope. They descended into the valley by dusk, following the river until they reached a small hollow near the trees. There, among the soft grass and the sound of running water, they made camp. Clara knelt, touching the earth. "No one's been here for years." Tahoma looked around, then nodded toward a distant rise. "My mother once told me of a place like this, where the world forgot to take sides." "Maybe this is it," Clara smiled faintly. "Then let's remind the world what it missed." Over the next days, they worked side by side. He built a lean-to from cedar branches while she gathered wild herbs and found a flat patch for planting. They drank from the river, washed away the soot of the fire, and learned the rhythm of quiet survival. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the peaks, painting the valley gold, Clara watched Tahoma by the fire. He was mending something again. A tear in her skirt this time, his large hands patient and careful. She couldn't help but laugh softly. "You still can't let a broken thing be, can you?" He glanced up, smiling. "I told you, mending keeps the heart steady." She moved to sit beside him, her gaze tracing his hands as they worked. "Then I suppose my heart's been in your hands for a while now." He set the needle down, eyes meeting hers with quiet fire. "And I will never let it tear again." They sat there, the fire crackling between them, the scent of pine and smoke weaving through the air. In that moment, words weren't needed. His hand found hers. The silence between them wasn't emptiness anymore, it was belonging. Days turned into weeks. The valley became their world, its mornings full of mist, its nights full of stars. Clara learned to read the land like he did, to follow tracks, to fish by the river, to listen to the way the wind changed before rain. Tahoma taught her the old words of his people, soft syllables that meant light, home, and forever. Sometimes they'd see a hawk overhead circling high, and he would nod toward it. "Watch her," he'd say. "He guards us." One morning she woke to find him carving something by the fire. When he was done, he handed it to her, a small wooden pendant shaped like a feather, polished smooth. "For when I'm gone hunting," he said quietly, "so you know I will return." She slipped it over her neck, her fingers trembling. "And if you don't?" He smiled, touching her cheek. "Then I'll come back with the wind." Tears glistened in her eyes. "You always say that." "Because it's true." Years later, though the world outside would forget their names, the valley would remember them. Travelers would speak of a hidden place where smoke sometimes rose from a distant fire, where laughter echoed faintly through the pines. They'd say an Apache and a white woman once lived there, building something the world tried to destroy. Peace. And every spring, when the river ran high and the hawks circled low, two feathers, one black, one white, would drift together downstream, carried by the same current. No one could ever tell where one began and the other ended, just as it was meant to be.